My name is Josh Jewell. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive Officer for ACE Consulting. Thank you guys for joining us today for the webinar. This is our first one of 2026, so we're excited to have everybody with us. So our topic today is navigating government shutdowns, best practices to mitigate schedule delays. What you'll learn today is how to anticipate shutdown-related scheduling impacts, identify shutdown-sensitive activities, protect float and critical path work, track the right schedule data during uncertainties, strengthen scheduled defensibility and documentation, and restart work efficiently post-shutdown. We've got Joey Summers with us today. Joey is the Senior Vice President of Field Operations for ACE Consulting. He also was previously the Senior Vice President of our Project Controls Division. So Joey knows a lot about this subject specifically. We're super happy to have him. Joey is a senior construction professional with over 20 years of experience in construction management across federal and private sectors. As the Senior VP of Field Operations at ACE, he leads program management execution, field oversight, and strategic delivery of complex construction projects. Like I mentioned, Joey brings deep expertise in the federal construction market, project scheduling, and delay analysis with a strong command of Primavera P6. So I think with that, I'm going to throw this over to Joey and let Joey get into everything.
All right. Thank you very much, Josh. So as Josh mentioned, I have a little over 20 years of experience in construction, worked on many federal projects. Here at ACE, we deal with mostly contractors who are working on federal projects. So we see very much firsthand the impacts that government shutdowns have on those projects and the contractors and the subcontractors, suppliers, everyone involved with the projects. So taking a look at our objectives for this, we mostly have project managers, schedulers, federal contractors that are joining us today. So it's going to be directed mostly towards that. We're going to take a look at proactive control versus reactive recovery when it comes to government shutdowns. As far as setting expectations, I'm going to look at practical approaches to dealing with these things. And it's going to be very much schedule focused because that's number one thing that's impacted when we do have a government shutdown. So taking a look at why shutdowns remain a recurring risk on federal projects. You can look historically, there have been many government shutdowns, projects affected every time that it does happen. Obviously, with the political cycles changing, that creates a lot of ongoing uncertainty. So you're never really sure when a shutdown is going to happen. A lot of times it sneaks up on you. Other factors, continuing resolutions versus full appropriations. There are federal project dependency on agency available. So certain agencies get shut down. It's going to affect the projects for those agencies, obviously. The importance of schedule management when it comes to government shutdowns is huge. That's really what's going to tell the story of how you're impacted and what you should be able to recover from the government. Shutdowns are foreseeable risk. We know it's a real actual risk that can happen. We just don't know the timing of when it's going to happen always. So it's important to have a backup plan knowing that a shutdown may happen sometime in the future. Schedulers must treat shutdowns as risk events, not anomalies. It's very important that you have a strong baseline schedule and you document everything throughout the project, especially during shutdowns. This is going to increase your defensibility towards the end of the project when you're trying to recover your losses. Preparation is going to help you protect both the schedule and whatever you're entitled to as part of that recovery. So understanding the shutdown impacts on a project schedule. So when a government shutdown happens, some of the things that likely will happen or may happen, non-essential federal employees are likely to be furloughed. Contracting officers and COR availability may be very limited. Funding obligations may pause, and some agencies may operate in limited capacity. So therefore, we know when a government shutdown happens, there's going to be impacts. We don't know exactly what those impacts are. It depends on the particular situation and the particular type of shutdown. But when it happens, it's important to understand everything that's going to be affected. Dive in a little deeper into impacts on funding approvals, inspections, and oversight. You're likely going to have delayed modifications and change orders, which is going to have a trickle effect on the project. No RFI responses or technical clarifications, those are likely going to be put on hold. Inspections are most likely going to be delayed, and there's a good chance for payment processing delays. So obviously, again, that's going to have a ripple effect with everybody involved with the project and greatly impact the schedule. Looking at some of the direct and indirect schedule impacts a little closer. So the direct impacts, you could have a full work suspension. There might be restricted site access, and then there's also stop work orders. Again, this is very situational and depends on the project that you're on. Could be impacted differently. Could be a total shutdown, nothing is moving, or maybe there's portions of it that can still continue. Indirect impacts could be resequencing from inefficiencies, subcontractor resource reallocation. Obviously, if a job shuts down for an extended period, they're not going to be able to have all their crews and all their people just sitting there waiting for it to come back up. So they're going to reallocate those crews to other projects. And then when the job does open back up, it's going to be very difficult to get those contractors, the same crews, the same people back on the project. So that's something that it's a huge impact that you got to track very closely. There's also loss of float without immediate critical delay. So while the shutdown might not immediately impact your critical path, it's going to start eating up float. So items that were previously not on the critical path may become part of the critical path. And then you're also going to be dealing with reduced productivity due to uncertainty. Anytime you have a shutdown and they don't know how long it's going to go, there's not a great sense of urgency on subcontractors, suppliers, everybody else. If there's a huge unknown out there, they're not going to be working as hard as they would if they knew the project was continuing. And taking a look at how shutdown delays differ from other project delays, the shutdown delays are often going to be external to the contractor. It's going to be out of the contractor's control. It's typically tied to the owner and or a government action. It may trigger suspension of work clauses in the contract. The impacts will likely extend beyond the shutdown duration. Again, that goes back to the resequencing, loss in productivity, trying to get subcontractors, certain crews back out there. Then there's also going to be entitlement analysis that differs from whether a subcontractor delays. So this is going to be handled very differently than your typical delays would be. And again, I go back to the contract. It's very important to know your contract and all the clauses in it and how to deal with this appropriately. Now, taking a closer look at key schedule risk that PMs and schedulers should expect when a shutdown does happen. With the work suspensions and partial shutdowns, like I mentioned before, you could have a full stop work, or you might be able to continue with limited operations depending on the situation. There could be selectively funded portions of the project. So maybe the entire project's not shut down, but a certain section of it or certain piece that was handled under a change order, maybe that part of the project shuts down. There could be security or base access limitations, depending on what all is involved in the shutdown. And you're going to receive contractual notice requirements. Make sure again you understand all the terms in your contract and how you're supposed to handle the impacts and delays. Delayed RFIs, submittals, agency responses. So all the paperwork, all the flow of information is likely to greatly slow down, if not come to a complete halt. So submittals are going to be stuck in the review cycle. RFIs are going to go unresolved, which may impact your critical path. Design clarifications are likely going to be paused, and you're going to accumulate approval backlog post shutdown. Inspection and acceptance delays. So there's likely going to be no government QA or QC during the shutdown. Obviously, that's going to halt a lot of inspections happening. Testing and turnover delays are likely, and your commissioning is also going to be delayed. Taking a look at resource demobilization and remobilization challenges. I touched on this briefly already, but you're going to have crews reassigned to other projects. That's great if the shutdown doesn't last very long and the crews can come right back. But in all likelihood, you're going to lose those crews or you're going to get partial crew back. So that's going to have a huge impact on your productivity because you're not going to have the same guys out there that are already used to the project and familiar with it. And everybody's going to be working with new people. It's going to kind of be like starting over from scratch again. So something to keep in mind. Aside from the manpower, you've also got the equipment. Most contractors are not going to keep their equipment sitting around waiting for the project to come back on. They're going to either return those or reallocate it. And a lot of times you can get that equipment back easily. Sometimes, depending on the equipment, you may run into trouble getting that back out there. You've got to consider what this disruption is going to have on the supply chain timing. This not only impacts the people actually on the project, but it has a ripple effect anyone who has a hand in the project. There's going to be productivity ramp up lag after the restart. Again, like I said, you're either bringing people back onto the job that were out there previously. More than likely, it's a mix of old people and new people. So that is going to affect productivity. And you're probably going to start back out slower. Loss of float and shifting critical paths. Like I mentioned previously, your near critical activities could become critical activities with that float disappearing. Float consumption during the waiting periods, logic changes that alter the critical path. So a lot of times when you have a shutdown like this, there's so many impacts. A lot of times the contractors start looking at what logic changes can we make to get this back on track. So that very well could have a huge impact on your critical path. Increased risk of concurrency arguments. Again, make sure you know your contract. And when those arguments come up, you're able to speak intelligently to them. So planning ahead, best practices before a shutdown. So you know a shutdown's coming. Now it's time to take a little closer look at what you can do to put yourself in the best position, knowing that you're going to have to endure a shutdown. First, you want to identify shutdown sensitive activities in your schedule. That's going to be any activities requiring government approval, inspection hold points, access dependent work, any funding dependent procurement items. Make sure you get all those items identified so you can highlight those and track everything with it appropriately. Next, you're going to evaluate your float, your critical path exposure, and near critical work. I recommend starting by identifying all activities with 20 days lesser float. You can define whatever threshold you want there. Maybe it's 20 days, maybe it's 40 days. Kind of depends on the size of your project and the complexity. But you want to identify those activities again so you can start watching those closely because they're not critical path now, but they very well may become critical path. You want to assess the fragility of the near critical chains. So in P6 Primavera is the scheduling software we primarily use. You've got a lot of options to look at the near critical items and the near critical paths. So I highly recommend doing that so you can see what issues you're going to run into the longer this shutdown extends. I also recommend running what if fragnet scenarios in your schedule. So if you're not familiar with fragnets, fragnet is essentially a mini schedule within the schedule. So when you know an impact's going to happen, you can build out this mini fragnet schedule, insert it into your schedule, and show the impact it has on how it delays the project, which activities it affects. So with this, you can run many what if scenarios before the shutdown even actually happens. So you can go ahead and start that communication with all parties ahead of time and have a much better plan in place for it. And lastly, on this one, you want to understand total float ownership assumptions. Again, this goes back to understanding your contract. If the delay starts eating float, you need to have a clear understanding. Does the government own this float? Does the contractor own this float? What do I owe to the subcontractor? Just make sure you have all those assumptions worked out and understand what the contract says. Scenario planning for full stop versus limited operations. So like I said previously, depending on the scenario, you could have a complete full stop or you may be able to continue limited operations. Regardless of which one it is, you want to make sure that you're developing alternate logic paths. Like I said, a lot of times, depending on the situation, you can make some logic changes in the schedule to help make up some of your time. I mentioned fragnet models go ahead and build those out. I suggest doing several different scenarios. As most of you know, in construction, it's a game of what could possibly go wrong and then planning for that accordingly. Consider demobilization and remobilization durations. Obviously, that is another time factor. Once the shutdown's over, that doesn't mean everybody's just going to be able to show up on the job site the next day and get started right back. There's going to be time in there to get them remobilized. So make sure that's accounted for. And then again, going back to the frag nets, you can also model impact durations. And what I mean by that is you can run several different scenarios in your schedule. You probably don't know how long the shutdown's going to last, but you could run scenarios for if it were to last 2 weeks, if it were to last 60 days, if it were to last 90 days. And that kind of gives you a better idea of what to do depending on how long the shutdown actually lasts. Lastly, you're going to want to align your schedule strategy with the contract language. I know I keep mentioning contract a lot, but it's extremely important, especially in situations like this, to make sure you can recover everything you need to make your contract whole. So you want to review the suspension of work clause, review all of your changes clauses, confirm what the notice requirements are, understand time extension procedures, and you also want to clarify whether work must continue where possible. In a lot of cases, if they have a shutdown, but they say, well, you can still work on this part, it might not make sense for you to do that because it's not productive, but they might have a requirement that you have to. So make sure you understand what those requirements are based on the specific contract. So you've done all this background research and planned for the upcoming shutdown. Now, it's important to make sure that you're communicating this planning with all the owners, subcontractors, and internal teams. I recommend having a pre-shutdown coordination meeting to talk through all these aspects. Make sure you're doing subcontractor readiness planning. It's great if the contractor's doing all this planning, but if you don't also make sure that your subcontractors are doing the planning, you're still not in great shape. You got to make sure all parties are on board and doing the proper planning. It's important to have internal executive briefings. Make sure your home office understands exactly what's going on, and they're prepared to help you with reallocating resources, crews, equipment. And then make sure you've got a great handle on your documentation protocols. I cannot stress this enough, especially when it comes to government work. Documentation is extremely important. You want to make sure you have all of your ducks in a row and you can paint a total picture for them so that when you request that extra time or money, you've got everything you need. All right. So we talked about what to do when you're planning for an upcoming shutdown. Now I want to go a little deeper into what to track during the shutdown. Again, I'm going to start with schedule because that's most important. That's king. Key schedule data and any contemporaneous documentation. So you want to make sure you're recording, obviously, the date, the time the shutdown impacts began. Look at all the activities directly affected. Make sure you're recording those clearly. Make sure you're taking into account your workforce levels before and after the shutdown. That helps, again, paint the picture to how the project was truly impacted, and then keep record of all the equipment that was demobilized. Make sure that you're tracking all work stoppages, access limitations, and approvals. Keep track of all the formal stop work notices, pending RFIs, the submittal log, any inspection delays, any correspondence with the contracting officer. All of this could come back up if you get into a debate with the government on what you should be able to recover or not, or if it were to go to litigation. Just make sure you have all that documentation and it's clearly organized. And that's another big key. A lot of times I've seen contractors just want to flood the government with information, but if it's not easily readable or easy to follow, presented in a clean manner, they're likely going to reject it and push it back. So make sure you organize that information as you go. Maintaining schedule updates during limited operations. Sometimes they're going to require you to continue monthly updates. Even if they don't, I still recommend doing that anyway, just to protect yourself. Again, that's constant communication. That's keeping your schedule up to date. That's helping to paint the picture of how you've been impacted by the shutdown. Make sure you're statusing actual start and finish dates accurately. Avoid any artificial progress adjustments. There can be a lot of pressure to do that sometimes, but you want to make sure you're holding everything accurate. Make sure that you document any out of sequence work clearly. A lot of times with shutdowns and major delays, there is resequencing in the work. You need to keep track of what that is exactly and what impacts it has, because almost always, if you resequence activities, you're going to have some kind of impact, whether it's productivity, monetary, getting other crews out there. Just make sure you're tracking all that. And then finally, on this point, preserving the schedule logic and integrity, extremely important. We work with a lot of clients who get into a bad situation because they've incurred a government shutdown. They want to make the owner, make the government happy. And so they've modified their schedule so much to try to make the end date still work or to improve it. And a lot of times we see that the schedule loses a lot of integrity in that process. We've seen people that will delete some activities, they'll break logic ties in order to hide delays. These kind of actions really hurt the contractor because it's much tougher to go back and say, well, this is how the shutdown really impacted me. If you don't have the accurate schedule to compare to the previous schedule, you're not in a good spot. Like I mentioned previously, make sure you use fragment modeling to show the shutdown impacts. That paints a very clear picture. And then make sure you're maintaining your baseline integrity. Again, that goes back to don't delete activities, avoid breaking logic ties. You might have to make some modifications, but just make sure you're tracking all that accordingly. Okay, so you've tracked stuff during the shutdown. Shutdown's finally over. Now we'll look at some restart and recovery best practices. Starting out with efficient remobilization planning. Like I said, you're probably going to run into a lot of issues with crews that have been reallocated. You got to confirm the workforce availability. Are you able to get the same crews out? Are you able to get the same people? Are you even able to get the same subcontractors out? Maybe they had previous commitments on other jobs and they only have one crew. Maybe you've got to find whole new subcontractors. Equipment, we discussed that. You've got to make sure you resecure all the equipment you need for the project. Validate all material deliveries. There's a good chance that some deliveries were in progress. They got put on a stop. Maybe that puts you at the back of the line. Maybe the lead time's much longer now. A lot of possible impacts with that. Reconfirmed subcontractor commitments. Like I mentioned, maybe you're working with some small contractors who had to move on to another project. Are they able to get back on the project, or do you need to look at other options there? Having those discussions up front and making sure you have that figured out ahead of time is critical. Sequencing work and adjusting logic ties. Like I said, you got to be very careful anytime you're messing with your schedule's logic. You can update logic, and in some situations, it makes sense to do that to get the project back on track. But you want to make sure it makes sense, and you want to make sure you're not hurting the job, hurting the schedule, hurting yourself. Evaluate what your new critical path is based on any adjustments you made. You want to identify recovery opportunities. Again, I would recommend bringing your subcontractors in for that. Reassess the whole schedule, see if there's opportunities that you can change some things to get back on track. But whatever you do, just avoid unrealistic compression. In these situations, a lot of time the government is going to pressure the contractor to compress the schedule and make up as much time as possible. A lot of times the contractor wants to do that for the government, but be careful with that pressure and just make sure you don't compress it to an unrealistic amount. Managing realistic recovery expectations. Again, not all lost time is recoverable. Everybody's going to try to do what they can to recover time, but some of it's just unavoidable. Keep in mind, acceleration requires cost and risk evaluation. A lot of times, owners will push on contractors, hey, just send more crews out here, send more people out here, work double shifts. These are all possible options, but there's also risk involved with that. If you get too many people working in one space, first you could create safety issues that you didn't have before because of increased manpower within a given location. There's also productivity issues. If you've got too many people working in the same area and they're fighting over space, fighting over each other, that's going to lower productivity. So these are all things to keep in mind when you're considering those as options. Avoid committing to any unrealistic recovery plans. Again, that goes back to just clear communication. Do what you can, but don't overcommit. And then lastly, align your recovery with contractual entitlement. Make sure, again, I go back to this contract again and again, but make sure you understand the contract inside and out, especially when it comes to these type of situations, and make sure your recovery plans are in alignment with all the clauses in the contract. Okay. That wraps up my part of the presentation. We will now open it up for any questions that anybody has.
All right, so we got one, and there may be some more context here. Greg, thank you for letting us know that you could give some if need be. So this is from Greg. He says, currently dealing with a major contract modification, USACE contract, and I've just learned, contrary to previous experience, that USACE doesn't allow anticipated weather delay within the calendar of your impact schedule. Do you have any experience with this particular issue?
So I'm trying to recall back to any scenarios where that issue has come up, and nothing in particular jumps out. But just again, in general, I go back to looking at the contract. Most USACE contracts are pretty standard, and it's the same from one job to the next, but there are variances in those. So whatever case you have on one project might not necessarily be the exact same situation on another project. So if I had this issue come up, that's one of the first places I'm going to look and see how the weather delays are incorporated into this government shutdown.
All right, here we go. Here's some more context for you. 13 million original contract value, wholesale change that required a design change, contract mod 5,300,000 calendar day impact.
Okay, and go back to the original question again, Josh.
Major contract modification, contrary to previous experience, USACE does not allow anticipated weather delay within the calendar of your impact schedule.
Yes, that would make sense. You're still gonna you would track any of your weather delays outside of that impact, but again, it goes back to making sure you're showing that impact as a fragnet in the schedule, and then you're going to have to track your weather delays outside of that.
Joey, thank you so much for the time, man. We really appreciate you jumping on here with us. If anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Thank you, guys.